All right, as people are joining here, good morning to everybody that's here. I'm going to give a couple more minutes for some stragglers that might be logging into Zoom or something like that. So thank you for your patience here. Patty, we'll for you and Scott, we'll give it maybe 3 more minutes and then I'll
Okay.
open us up and we'll get going.
Okay.
One more minute and then start. All right. Let's go ahead and begin. I'll kind of keep track of maybe some people that are in the waiting room and I'll admit them when they show up. But I did just want to say real quick for Patty and I, it's good morning. I know we may have some people that are on the East Coast, so good afternoon to everybody. Hope everybody's having a good Thursday and just a good week. We are very excited about this opportunity that we have with Patty and Scott to do kind of an interview, a little Q&A, I guess, and just get to learn more about APS Payroll. They've been a vendor of the church co-ops for about 4.5 years, coming on 5 years, and we've loved our partnership with them. So I did just want to thank everybody for being here. My name is Christopher. I am the COO of the church co-op. So I have the privilege of working very closely with our vendors, which I love to do. And then as we've been kind of announcing, as you've seen, especially when you signed up for this kind of webinar, we have Patti, who's our CEO. And then we are also joined by Scott, who's a VP at APS Payroll. And there's some other APS employees as well that have joined us. So we're very excited about that. I just wanted to go through real quick. Everybody's pretty much already done this, so I appreciate it. But just a couple of housekeeping things, since we want to be respectful of everybody's time, especially Patti and Scott's. Just make sure that you keep yourself muted. That way, I know that with Zoom, there's, Wi-Fi and everything like that. There can be some issues or the sound audio from other people. That way they can be focused on the questions and best benefiting the people that have joined. What I have done is I've opened up the chat. What we're going to do is we're going to have a couple of times where Patti will ask Scott some questions. They'll have some conversation. And then Patty will pause and just have some time where people can ask questions. We're going to do that through the chat. I'll read off your question. Again, that just makes sure that the flow of time is proper. And again, we can be respectful of everybody's time today. So anytime throughout, if you have a question, if Patty asks a question to Scott, please put it in the chat if you have something that you would like a follow-up about. And then when Patty announces that, we'll have some times for some questions, I'll read those off. So don't think I'm not seeing your questions. Other than that, I'm trying to make sure I've covered everything here. Patty, unless you have something else to add, I'm going to turn it over to you then.
Okay, well, thank you, Christopher, and thank you, Scott, for taking the time to answer these questions today. I have a list of them. I'm going to start off with asking you, Scott, if you'll share a little bit about APS, payroll, and your role in the organization.
Absolutely. Thanks, Patty. And I really appreciate this opportunity to be here. So APS, we are in the payroll, the HCM world. So we really manage the employee life cycle all the way from recruiting to retirement. So my role in the organization, I'm our vice president of sales. This is my 15th year with APS. I started off knocking on doors back in 2008 and grew up through the ranks. I am fortunate enough to lead our sales organization at this time.
Okay. And are there other payroll companies marketing churches and faith-based organizations today? And then what sets APS apart from other payroll and HR solutions?
It's a good question. So there are some good options if you look at the total addressable market of the small to mid-sized business for payroll and HR. What I realized very early on, and to get a little personal, in 2008, I started my professional journey with APS, but it was also the same year that I started my Christian journey. It was really cool for those two worlds to coalesce with each other. And I realized very early on in my professional career, going back to one of the first sales calls I went on with our president, was that churches are complex. And there are a lot of anomalies within the faith-based industry. And so I realized very early on that even though there are a lot of good options in our space, there are not a lot of options that know churches the way that APS knows churches. So I think it's that knowledge, and we'll expand on that further on our discussion, but it's the knowledge of what makes a single or multi-campus church unique. That's what sets APS apart from others in our space.
Good. So that kind of leads right into my next question. Scott, you've been working with churches for quite some time. What are some common frustrations that you've observed in your journey with them?
Absolutely. So I can really boil it down to three major categories, and then we'll expand on some details. So one of the first things, whether it's a small or large church, a lot of our church clients are frustrated with managing taxation for ordained ministers. They're very complex. There's some anomalies there, and there's frustration with the payroll aspect. Secondly, as churches plan to grow, they're planning, they're growing in campuses. Churches become bigger businesses, and they struggle to centralize data for multiple workflows, and then that expounds once they grow into multiple campuses. And then thirdly, a lot of churches use industry-specific accounting software. ACS, Shelby, QuickBooks, Intacct, Blackbaud. If they grow to a point where they need to use a system like ours, they're challenged with aligning data in the GL from a system like APS. So again, it's payroll, it's growth, and really marrying HR and payroll data with a very church-specific accounting structure.
Okay, good frustration. I would like to take this time to open that up to the chat to see what frustrations our attendees either are experiencing now or have experienced in the past. So let's just give you a few minutes to write in that chat what's your frustrations. And Christopher, will as they come in, you can ask them.
Okay.
Another thing I'd like you to put in there is what's your most time-consuming task regarding payroll?
Yeah, oftentimes the payroll function is part of a greater job responsibility for our church clients, whether that's a financial secretary, a business admin, an executive pastor. So the goal is to try to spend as little time on it as possible, but still ensure that the church stays compliant, that they're being good stewards of the offerings that, pay wages. And then as they grow, they can trust the system to support that growth and not hinder it.
Yeah, one thing that's come through that of biggest frustration is multi-state SIU setup and filings. That's what Brittany had said. I do like this. Beth said, I'm not a church, but as a nonprofit, the documentation of time and effort for grant reports is a huge struggle.
Yeah.
I don't know, Scott, if maybe you can go off of that a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. Later on in the discussion, we'll have a conversation around attendance and labor tracking, and I'll address that topic at that time.
Okay. Yeah, and then we also have keeping up with state law changes. That's a huge frustration. I'm sure that is. Just going through all that, Patty and I have been discussing some of those things here in Texas recently. And then also state unemployment insurance as well has come through.
Yeah.
It used to be that the law changed maybe once every 2 years, 1 year, and now it's multiple times throughout the year. It's just a lot to keep up with.
Yep.
Okay, any other questions before we go on, Christopher?
I would say go ahead and go on.
Okay. So Scott, I have found that when the pain of staying the same is greater than the pain of change, people have a tendency to move forward. I know even with the co-op, for a few years when I came on board, we're using other software for payroll. But what that meant was trying to keep up with everything. And then when an employee changes, bringing them up to speed. And it was just so much easier for us we moved to APS. We've really enjoyed it. But it not only saved us time, but it gave us peace of mind. My next question to you, Scott, is what do you typically find that churches, when do they reach the decision to switch from their payroll system to a new one in HR?
Yeah. So really it spans the gamut between reactive and proactive. So from like a reactive perspective, a couple of the items mentioned in the chat were understanding state UI, especially as it relates to churches that could be pseudo exempt based on their status, and also law changes, whether that's, those are payroll changes, state changes, HR changes. I've gotten a phone call from a specific church I can remember and back in my selling days that I was trying to get their business. They were right on our addressable market. They really would benefit because they were growing, but it took getting a series of IRS notices for them to finally switch. So you have the challenge where churches are very specific from a tax perspective. And sometimes churches, even big churches, get it wrong. And so whether it's audits, they find themselves in tax compliance issues. There was a big misclassification audit that hit a lot of churches about 10 years ago. And so on the reactive frame of mind, that the pain of payroll can say, hey, it's fine. Let me just get this off my plate. We should be mindful of our tithes and offerings and make sure that we're not paying unnecessary penalties. On more of the proactive side, it's really when churches start to grow. Churches can go from a very small feel to a mid to larger business when they start to get run the 50 employee mark, and then when they start to have the exponential effect of growing campuses. So really, again, it's if the tax pain is becoming a challenge, and if they see growth on the horizon and they find they can't scale and manage the primary goal, which is to reach more lives for Christ with multiple campuses, they can't do that if the admin burden hinders that.
Right. The more you grow, the more complexities. Speaking of complexities, that leads into some questions I have on payroll complexities. For instance, what steps do you take to ensure accurate income reporting for ordained ministers, considering the complexity of the FICA exemptions and the self-employment taxes?
Absolutely. So definitely have to give a disclaimer that I nor APS are your tax advisors. I am not a tax expert. Definitely can advise consulting a tax professional when it comes to an ordained minister trying to figure out their own situation. And that's where I'll start, because there was a law passed in 1968 and it was updated in 77 and 86 and 2000 that gave pastors, ordained pastors, governance from the IRS as to their self-employed status. So ordained pastors are odd because their income is viewed as self-employment income. However, they'll also get a W-2 from the church. So again, how do we ensure accurate income reporting? Well, our system was built to handle anomalies. So for example, a pastor who's self-employed but also W-2, that pastor needs an accurate W-2 at year end. So of course you have to make sure everything's in the right boxes. And then depending on a pastor's agreement with the IRS for their self-employment, they could make quarterly estimates. And so they need the payroll engine to withhold the accurate amount of tax for them to either make those estimates or for that self-employment tax to hit the right box, the W-2. So again, I'm not a tax advisor. However, systematically, we understand how a ordained minister should be set up in a system and how the system can help automate some of the tax withholding that a normal employee doesn't have to mess with. Additionally, not every industry can be exempt from FICA taxes. So if I'm a server at a restaurant, I can't say, hey, can you please exempt me from FICA taxes? It doesn't work that way. With APS, there are checkboxes on the tax record for the employee that can allow the admin to subject or exempt a pastor from the appropriate taxes. So we make it easier, and it's more well defined than our system.
That brings in the housing allowance. When I served on church staffs for several years, they change them often throughout the year, their amounts and stuff. It brings on another whole complexity, but can you elaborate on the challenges related to proper taxation and reporting of housing allowances for ordained ministers?
Yeah, so housing allowance is a very interesting benefit to pastors. So again, I'm not a tax expert. I'm not a CPA. I don't work for the IRS, but the church does have the ability to decide on what the housing allowance is for the ordained minister. And essentially that has to be taxed it has to be taxed separately than normal wages, because there is shelter from self-employment tax. But also it needs to hit a spot on a box on the W-2. So we brought on churches that, maybe they're with a larger payroll provider that was looping in housing allowance with their box one wages, which is a problem, which is essentially make a pastor overpay in self-employment tax. Also, it needs to typically hit a different line item on the GL for the budget committee to make sure they understand the housing allowance for their ordained staff. And then with a lot of churches, that housing allowance could either be included or excluded from the total benefit expense. So for example, some retirement providers will include housing in a percentage of retirement. Same thing with workers' comp or certain health benefits. So it's an additional anomaly to ordained minister. And so essentially the church and the payroll company have to make sure it's set up properly, and it's firing off in the right boxes towards the right benefit expense and the right taxation.
So important. And we do the Metro Salary Survey every other year for churches, and this is a number one issue coming, and how, asking them for numbers, but we get all the numbers that are all different across the board because of the way they handle them on their GL, and they're going right to their GL. So, well, that brings me to another question about the housing. How do you address variations in state regulations regarding housing allowance taxation?
You would think that the IRS and state and local jurisdictions would all be aligned with how they view taxation on housing allowance, but we found out that not every, like with any government entity, they tend to view things differently. So again, it's not APS's stance to advise on maybe a local tax perspective. However, we have the ability that, for example, if there's a church in Pennsylvania where the state views it as tax exempt, but the local jurisdiction doesn't. The payroll company has to set this up the right way so that the church is not in hot water. So a benefit to a company like APS that understands their complexities is just a way to assign taxation down to the income level to make sure that the church, again, is good stewards of the offerings and tithes that are used to pay employees and taxes.
Good. Okay. Another question, Scott. Most churches today understand the need for dual approval when it comes to cash flow. And most of them are pretty good at that, but share why a dual approval is important for payroll submission, and how does it contribute to the financial stewardship?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So, I mentioned at the beginning that typically payroll is a component of someone's job. Typically, it's not their entire job, because with systems like APS, you can automate a lot, and someone can handle payroll as part of their job function. But what that does is, no human's perfect, and there are always errors that could happen. So you want to be able to safeguard payroll submission. So you asked a question around being a good financial steward. Payroll is typically a top one or two business expense, right? It is a serious amount of money that is paid. And with nonprofits, whether it's a nonprofit or church, most, if not all, of the money used to pay employees comes from tithes, offerings, donations, right? So you have the number one business expense, and making sure that you process accurately so that you're not over or underpaying an employer or the government. So we know that we have to be careful. So if you have someone that's processing payroll as part of their job, let's not put the onus on them to actually hit the final submit button. So what we typically suggest and see is that, let's say that I am the financial secretary, and it's my job to aggregate data from the campuses, go through a checks and balances, and then hit the initial submit button. Well, let's say, Patty, you're the executive pastor, and it's really your job to hit the final approval. Well, you'd want to have clarity into the total amount, and you'd also want us to have clarity on potential errors. So one benefit our clients have in that submission process is that we can show that approver a comparison between the payroll that's about to be submitted and the one paid previously. So you can look for anomalies or outliers, and again, have that confidence that when you click approve for final, that it's been run through an automated checks and balances process.
And I've actually gone back and not approved something because I wanted more information, and it's easy to get it. The information, I like that.
Absolutely.
Is there anything our attendees, we talked about GL, or you talked about GL and the importance of setting that up correctly. What do our attendees need to know about setting up those chart of accounts for accurate GL reporting and budgeting?
Such an important topic. So there are churches that I've talked to over the years that have avoided or fought using a system like ours because they were concerned with still getting the same GL reporting that they had today. And really, to expand on that, churches, whether they view them as cost centers, and typically churches have budget committees that are made up of laymen that help the church make financial decisions once a year, whether it's the deacons, a budget committee. And churches need to be able to line item out the wage expense in a very detailed but simple way that helps the church and the committees make good decisions. So if I've been processing in Shelby for 15 years and I'm growing and I need a company like APS, well, I might be concerned with using an outside system because I want to make sure my chart of accounts and my GL is as accurate and simple as it is today. So the thing to know is that you have to work, whether it's APS or another company, you have to make sure that your chart of accounts is in a great state where it is today. And then you need to mirror the foundational setup in the payroll system that allows a GL export to hit the GL in the right way, that allows your budget committee and your financial committee to still have the same visibility And you're not creating issue where, wait, hey, we had all this detail before, but now we use a system and now I just have lump sum wages and I don't differentiate between housing allowance and the children's ministry. It can create a challenge. And we brought over clients that have made that mistake of not getting proper GL reporting. So my advice is that should be a step one foundational setup. Take your GL and make sure if you're using an outside system that foundational build looks similar to get the same results.
Good, very good. I think this is another great time to take a moment to open the chat up because he covered a lot of complexities right here. Any questions you have on any of your stuff from GL reporting to housing to any of the topics?
Yeah, and maybe as people are asking their questions, I did have a follow-up question, Scott, on something that Patti had mentioned. Patti, you talked about when the pain of staying the same is greater than the pain of changing. That's when you see that desire to maybe move forward with something else. Scott, you started talking about with churches, that could look like if you're getting 50 plus employees, there's frustrations, there's growing pains. When you think about other nonprofits, such as the co-op, for example, what are some frustrations that you see with other nonprofits that aren't churches? Like with Beth saying that there's other things that they have to struggle with, and there's frustrations that she has because they're a nonprofit. Maybe you could dive into that a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. So with nonprofits they're outside of churches, she basically mentioned time labor reporting, time and effort is the verbiage that she used. So nonprofits aren't paying employees from tithes, but they are paying employees from grants, funds, and nonprofits typically go through serious auditing, so they need to be able to reconcile every dollar paid with what was received. So typically when our nonprofit clients come to us, they need a better way to have reporting and visibility without making it a nightmare for the employee. So let's say, Christopher, you're paid really from 3 grants and you need to be able to track time per grant. I need to make it easy on you, but also allow the reporting to be ideal so that when I get audited or for my 12-month grant period, I can show the hours and wages paid to each employee. So I guess to give you the short answer, nonprofits and faith-based do align with the complexities of how they pay employees, and there needs to be a lot of visibility. Sometimes that can create headache for the employee. So if I really need to get accurate reports, it could make your job harder. Let's not do that. Let's make it easier for you to make my life easier, and in turn, we'll do the same.
Love it. Thank you for that. It's great.
Absolutely.
Any questions, Christopher, in the chat?
Not yet. We can give it one more minute just to see, but I'd written that question down when he was talking about that. I thought it was good to hear. So thank you, Scott.
Okay. I'll tell you what, you can still write in the chat. We'll catch them after our next section. I want to go ahead and I got some more questions for Scott that I want to make sure he answers. So Scott, that leads to a whole new issue here of decentralized business, multi-campuses. When managing multi-campuses in a decentralized church structure, how do you approach delegation of responsibilities to ensure a smooth operation?
Yeah, so typically we see that a church is a single campus entity and they are planning to grow into multi-campus. So the first thing I suggest is conducting a self-audit of workflows, data, and processes. How does it work with one campus and what time does it take and how efficient is it or not? Because when you start adding campuses to that, either your process can be scaled, repeated, or it's going to intensify and multiply the problems. So really, the first step is understanding how much, like, where's my data? Where are my efficiencies? Where are my inefficiencies? How much time does payroll and HR take? And then that can create enlightenment on what I need to do with my single campus to then scale it to multiple campuses. So from those exercises, typically our church clients will understand what processes need to be owned where, what information do we need to share with the campuses or keep siloed, and then what does true delegation of responsibility look like?
Okay. What challenges would they face as they're planning on expanding to multiple campuses?
Yeah, again, it's where is the data? So
Okay.
if I have 50 employees today and I use 3 different systems and I add another campus, now that's really 3 times 2 is 6. And so for um, every system that's being used to house data and every process that's siloed, you're basically multiplying times the number of campuses that you have. So where is the data? Are the workflows defined? If they're not defined, then it's going to be continued ambiguity as we bring on multiple campuses.
Okay.
And then we really recommend being very candid with responsibilities. When you add a new campus, you're typically going to have either, I guess, one of two scenarios. You're going to leverage existing admin staff to build that one up, or you're going to have dedicated staff to that campus. And they're going to have challenges with building the campus and really their priority of mission, reaching people. Let's not make the admin job harder of who's responsible for what systems do they use, and how do we get people paid accurately and not create a bunch of headaches.
Okay. Which moves us to recruiting and onboarding. So considering the unique recruiting needs of churches, how do you centralize pre-hire data while maintaining autonomy with guardrails?
Again, great question. So for a usual for-profit, they want to cast a wide net and really post on Indeed, ZipRecruiter, social networks, get as many qualified applicants as they can, and then run them through their hiring process. Churches can work that way, but typically there are hiring committees or search committees. So churches have committees for everything, right? So you want to be able to streamline the applicant flow, but in comparison or in contrast to for-profit, let's allow the hiring committee to have access to certain elements of recruiting. So you do have to be mindful of confidentiality, but if it's you and me and Christopher on a hiring committee, and we bring in Emily and Elizabeth as applicants, well, there needs to be a single system for us to view those applicants and put our notes in from our conversations, that bubbles up maybe to the deacon board, to the executive pastor. So the short answer is, let's make it easier. Let's create visibility, but let's not allow certain users to, extend a job offer if they don't need to.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Churches have come a long ways in conducting background checks. They're doing pretty good about that. But how do you balance that need with your HR process?
I heard a stat recently that 40% of nonprofits still don't conduct background checks. So it's when you look at churches and who they hire, could be parishioners, members of the church, but those that work at a church tend to be trusted and have access to data. They work with children. It's very, very imperative, even if there's a referral, even if it's a member of a church, it's very, very imperative to run new employees through a background check. It's paramount, but it's been alarming how many churches don't. So I would recommend it as a staple, whether you use, our integrated solution or if you have a trusted third party. I don't care who you get the background check from. It needs to be done.
Right. Of course, we've always said that the background check, it depends on what states are doing them and how they're doing them, but nothing beats a good hiring process.
Mm-hmm.
So I've worked with churches for over 30 years, Scott, and I think what I've observed is the biggest confusion comes with the diversity and labor types. Exempt, non-exempt, a lot of confusion, salary, hourly, and that whole role, especially when it comes to musicians and nursery workers. My question to you is this: what strategies do you recommend for managing time capture for employees working at multiple locations or using mobile options?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and this also I can bring in Beth's question here too. So again, about 10 years ago, there was a big misclassification audit, and I remember those days of seeing a lot of churches just pay someone a weekly salary, and that salary was 90% under the exempt line. But that was a really common practice for nursery workers, maybe part-time custodians that help clean the church. And so there was a big challenge, and churches did have to pay and start defining their processes, having a system in place, paying people hourly, tracking time. So really, the first thing I'll say is don't pay nominal salaries. It's just something that you should get out of. And whether it's musicians or whether we're just tracking hours, there has to be an easy and effective way to capture time. So if you've got maybe like musicians that work 3 hours a week, well, you can actually pay them per service, but I still recommend them clocking in and out just so the church can guarantee that if they get audited, if there is a misclassification situation that arises, you can produce the records that we paid Patty for her musical services at $25 a service, but we also had her clock in and out, and you can see that her hours worked were way under 40 hours a week.
Okay, good.
And again, going back to Beth's question about tracking time for grant reports, it's very common in nonprofits. Now, typically churches don't use labor layers. They're typically tracking time to one layer, but if my time needs to go towards a certain grant, well, it needs to be easier for me to do that. So we have a functionality called dimensions that our clients can set up grants or funds or projects or clients, whatever they want to track in terms of a layer, and then employees can assign time, whether clock into those or just assign, hey, I worked 8 hours on this project today.
Okay. Along that same issue, how do you structure the payroll process for all multi-campus churches, balancing autonomy with the need for final approval from the main campus?
Yeah, so again, you have to look at what you're doing today with one campus and then understand what processes, responsibilities, and visibilities can scale. So again, defining what it looks like today and knowing that as I add layers, it can either add complexity or I can scale and it can be efficient. So delegation of responsibility is crucial. Secondly, it's visibility. Now, typically campuses need to have access to data and they need to play within their guardrails, but we don't need them potentially seeing salary and wage data, and we definitely don't need them to be able to submit yes on a payroll. That should go back up through the main campus. So my advice when structuring is, again, understanding where your data is today, what do your workflows look like, but delegate responsibility and be candid about responsibility. So most common we can see with our multi-campus churches that the executive pastor or the admin team of that campus is responsible for approving total time cards. They could have responsibility in performance management, getting employee action forms signed. But we want to make sure the main campus gets final approval. So let's just make it easier on them to play their role in the journey.
Okay. Can you give an example of a successful implementation where each campus assists in preparing its payroll for its final approval at the main campus?
Yeah, so one of our most tenured clients is Hillside Christian Church, and they are about a 7 campus church, I believe in Texas. So they came to us trying to facilitate growth. So what they understood was that they couldn't scale and grow effectively when their data and processes were in multiple systems. So it really makes sense, even outside of churches, that as businesses grow, let's have one system that we can use to pay employees, collect their time, allow them to e-sign documents, enroll in benefits, manage their performance. So Hillside really came to us looking to solve that problem. And they've been a client of ours for close to 15 years now and have continued to grow. Without having to grow staff, they can let the system automate a lot of processes.
Very good. We can either stop. I have some closing questions for you. But before we do that, I do want to one more time open up the chat to see if anybody has any questions before I ask you your last four.
Absolutely.
So not really a question here, Patty and Scott, but a comment that was made. So maybe Scott, you can touch on this if you can. So John said this: I made several attempts to match my GLs between APS and Shelby, but I still have issues under deduction liability and under employment expense. For example, items under pension and health insurance do not match the payroll sum page. Could you maybe talk about that, or is that something where he needs to have a further discussion with you later?
Yeah, John, please, I'll make sure that my email's in the chat. So those should line up. Typically I see either coding errors as the main culprit, but I'll make sure that you and I can have a conversation to make sure that those line up.
Great. Yeah, does anybody else have anything before Patty asks some of these closing questions? I'll look at the chat for just a second here, Patty, and then you can ask those remaining questions. And if somebody types something in while you're asking those questions, I might just interrupt for just a second so we can get those in.
Scott, you've covered some really important considerations for our listeners today. I do have some closing questions for you. Could you give an example of a church or nonprofit that greatly benefited from implementing APS solutions, particularly in addressing payroll and HR challenges?
Yeah, so again, we've got several churches that have, been small, 2, 3, 5 employees, all the way up to some of the largest churches in America. So I went back and looked at one of our case studies for Central Christian Church out of Nevada. And back when they came on, they were one of the top 100 churches in America. Now I believe they have 15 campuses and continue to grow with APS. So I touched on something earlier, is that when a church starts to grow and scale, if they can define their processes, delegate responsibility, and centralize data, then that's the formula that can create a successful growth. And so it makes sense to centralize with an APS. So they came to us from another vendor that was not familiar with churches, and they found out they had some data in different systems and realized they could centralize that within APS. So in addition to that, I didn't touch on this earlier, but there's a lot of confidentiality concerns when it comes to churches. Again, a lot of employees are members of the church, so it makes sense as churches grow to ensure that the right information is being disseminated, but the certain confidential information is kept even from maybe the financial secretaries of the world. So I really remember Central Christian coming to us at a time when they had 7 campuses, and they've doubled in size since then. So the same theme, it's working with a church-specific provider who understands churches, and then being able to centralize processes and allow a system to do a lot of the heavy lifting.
Okay, you've touched on some of my second question, but I'm going to ask it again. What steps does APS take to ensure that its payroll and HR solutions help churches and nonprofits remain compliant with tax regulations and reporting requirements, especially given the complexities of ordained ministers and housing allowances?
Yeah, absolutely. So again, we're not a tax advisor, so I have to make that say that disclaimer one more time. But we do become the reporting agent for our clients. So the tax liability and the accuracy of it is actually our responsibility. We're the ones filing the 941s, our name's on the state withholding and SUTA returns. And so we want everything to be accurate. We also conduct parallel payroll testing in our implementation process, which isn't a standard across payroll companies. So if it's your first payroll with APS, and you want to make sure that gross to net for every employee, all the taxes are set properly, that's something that we can produce for a client prior to their first check date. And then also our clients approve the taxation and W-2 boxes of all incomes and deductions. So they can ensure that for housing allowance, it's set up the way that hits the box that needs to be hit. And then
Yes, go ahead.
just finally, that we don't gate our tax team. In our industry, every payroll provider has a tax team. And most of our competitors gate that tax team to where a client can't talk directly with them. So that's something that's different with APS. So if there is a tax issue, a tax concern, we don't gate that team. So our clients can talk with our tax agents around any concerns.
One of the things that I came across when I was consulting with churches was that some of the payroll services do reverse deductions for housing allowance, which really is not what you want to use. And I'm glad that yours does not do that. Okay, question number 3. In your opinion, what are the key trends or developments in church payroll and HR processing, and how is APS prepared to address these changes?
Yeah, it's a great thing that churches are growing, because of what it means is that the Christian message is being spread. And what that's done is, put the message of Christ out there. We're attracting a new audience and generations, but that's also forcing churches to become more sophisticated, more agile, and really, I hate to say the term big business, because that's not a very church specific term, but they're having to become more modern and more agile. And so at the same time, a lot of our church clients have lean HR resources, and they don't have, 2, 3, 4 people to manage payroll and HR and keep up with trends. So we've just seen the needs of our churches grow. And one feature that we recently released was our AI assist, which can help our clients in general, but for our nonprofits and our faith-based, let AI help give insight into data, help write job descriptions, and just be that secondary, angel on your shoulder to make sure that as the church grows, that we are not putting the church into a compliance situation, and we're able to leverage software to do more and rely on manual people processes less.
I've got a follow-up question for you, Patti.
Okay.
This is from Beth as well as Scott. She asks, is there a way to have 2 layers of allocations? For example, an employee that is allocated to a certain program then has 2 funding sources.
I don't like saying blanket yes. I don't see anything necessarily wrong with that, Beth, but I would like to talk to you one-on-one about that.
There we go. Okay. Perfect. Patti, do you have any other questions you want to ask?
Well, that led into my last question of, is there any way our audience can engage with you or APS for further questions or guidance on topics? So this is a great last question. Maybe you could put that in the chat room as well, Scott.
Yeah, I will put my email into the chat. I don't know if I can do this correctly. Keegan makes fun of me because I'm not tech savvy. So that's me. Keegan Glick is on the line. He is our account executive, senior account executive that primarily works with our churches. So he's brought on more churches than anybody here. If you want to ask me any questions, feel free. I just dropped my email, but also Keegan Glick as well. He's your guy.
Hey guys, I just want to say hey real quick. I actually got a bunch of clients on here right now. So Brian, Gordon, Sherry, Becky, Yolanda, really good to see you guys. And thanks for everyone for just jumping on and listening to this conversation. We really enjoy getting to work with you guys and just, become a bigger player in this industry. And a lot of that is really due to y'all in this relationship. So thank y'all.
Oh, thank you, Keegan. Appreciate it. Well, Patti, do you have anything else that you want to ask Scott? Any further?
I don't, except to say thank you very much for taking the time to share your knowledge.
Yeah, this has been great, Scott. Patti, thank you both for giving up your time today to do this. Thank you for everybody for joining us. As Scott mentioned, his email as well as Keegan's are in the chat. I've had somebody ask if they can get a recording of this. Yes, I'm actually going to post my email, which I believe all of y'all have because I sent you the link to this. but it's in the chat as well. You're more than welcome to email me. I will get you this recording. And then also, if you have any questions for myself about what Patti and I do, I know that a lot of you know what APS Payroll does, but we would love to share a little bit more about us. So I've provided a link to our website as well, and how we help churches and nonprofits partner with vendors that help them. And like I mentioned at the beginning, we love APS and what they do for our members. So other than that, I don't have anything. Again, thank you guys, Patti, Scott, thank you for your time. And I'll stay on here. That way the chat doesn't leave. So everybody leave when you have any information or anything, and then I'll leave last so that I don't kick anybody off.
Thanks a lot, y'all, for your time. I look forward to hearing from anybody that wants to chat further.
Perfect. Thank you, everybody.
See you guys.